A virgin mountain man rides through a snowstorm, his rifle slung low, when he sees her. A young widow hanging from a tree, a frozen sign swinging in the wind. White man don't forgive. He cuts her down, her breath barely there. And in that moment, his quiet mountain life shatters forever. She's not just any widow. She's the survivor of a crime the whole town tried to bury. A secret soaked in land, blood, and lies. Now, the mountain man must protect her from the very people who call themselves righteous. The church bell tolls. The sheriff loads his gun. And behind every curtain in Silver Hollow, someone whispers her name. But when mercy meets hatred on the gallows, can a man who's never known love teach a town that God still forgives? Or will they hang them both before sunrise? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The bitter wind howled through the Colorado peaks, driving needles of snow against Asher Boone's weathered face. He pulled his wool scarf higher, squinting through the swirling white. A week trapped in his line shack by the blizzard had left him restless, his supplies running low. Now that the storm had finally broken, he needed to check his trap lines and replenish his stores. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine snow as he made his way down the mountain trail. His boots crunched through the crusty surface, sinking deep into the powder beneath. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the soft whisper of wind through the pines and the occasional crack of a snow-laden branch. Then he spotted them, wolf tracks, fresh in the new-fallen snow. They led towards the creek, where the animals often came to drink from holes in the ice. Asher adjusted his path to follow them, more out of habit than any real intention to hunt. His years as a Union scout had taught him to read sign like others read books. The great ponderosa pine near the creek came into view, its massive trunk dark against the white landscape. Something moved beneath its branches, something that shouldn't be there. Asher stopped, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle slung across his back. But as he drew closer, his heart nearly stopped. A woman hung from one of the lower branches, suspended by a rough hemp rope. Her dark dress fluttered weakly in the wind, dusted with snow. A wooden sign swung from her neck, the crude letters stark against the pale wood. White man don't forgive. "Dear God in heaven," Asher whispered, dropping his rifle in the snow as he rushed forward. His fingers, clumsy with cold and shock, fumbled at his belt for his hunting knife. The rope was frozen, requiring all his strength to saw through. He caught her as she fell, easing her gently to the ground. Her skin was pale as the snow around them, her lips tinged blue. But when he pressed trembling fingers to her throat, he found it. The faintest flutter of a pulse. Barely there, but holding on. Hope surged through him, followed quickly by fear. She wouldn't last long in this cold. Without hesitation, Asher shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her still form. He gathered her in his arms, surprised at how little she weighed, and turned back toward his cabin. The sign clattered against his chest as he moved, and he paused long enough to pull it roughly from her neck, throwing it aside with barely contained anger. The journey back seemed endless. The woman remained motionless in his arms, her breath coming in shallow gasps that grew weaker with each passing minute. Asher found himself muttering prayers he hadn't spoken since his brother died in the war, fragments of scripture his mother had taught him long ago. "The Lord is my shepherd," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion and exertion. "I shall not want—" The words trailed off as he struggled through a particularly deep drift. "Please, Lord, please help her hold on." Finally, his cabin came into view, a humble structure of rough-hewn logs with smoke still curling from the stone chimney. He shouldered open the door, careful not to bump her head, and carried her inside. The warmth hit him like a physical force after the bitter cold outside. Asher laid her gently on his narrow bed, quickly adding more wood to the dying fire. His hands shook as he pulled every blanket he owned from his storage chest, layering them over her still form. Her clothes were soaked through with snow and ice, but he hesitated, his face flushing. It wasn't proper for a man alone to... "Ain't about proper now," he muttered to himself, forcing his hesitation aside. "It's about keeping her alive." Working as quickly and respectfully as he could, Asher removed her frozen outer garments, replacing them with one of his own clean flannel shirts. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice the angry purple bruising around her neck, standing out in stark contrast to her pale skin. The sight made his jaw clench with anger. He set a pot of snow to melt on the stove, preparing to make hot water bottles to warm her core temperature. As he worked, his eyes kept straying to her hand, where a simple gold band encircled her finger. A widow then, or worse, a wife whose husband might still be searching for her. Either way, someone had meant for her to die alone in the cold, with that hateful message around her neck. Through the long night, Asher kept his vigil. He replaced the cooling water bottles with fresh hot ones, monitored her breathing, and continued his halting prayers. The lamplight cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls as he worked, his movements gentle despite his large, calloused hands. "Hold on, ma'am," he murmured, adjusting a blanket. "Just hold on." As the hours crept by, color slowly returned to her cheeks, though she remained unconscious. Her breathing grew stronger, more regular, and Asher felt hope begin to replace his initial fear. He settled into his chair by the bed, rifle across his knees. Whoever had done this might still be out there, and he meant to be ready if they came looking to finish what they'd started. The wind continued to howl outside, rattling the cabin's shutters, but inside it was warm and quiet, save for the crackling of the fire and the woman's steady breathing. Asher found his thoughts turning to White Elk, the old Ute elder who lived down in the valley. The sign's message suggested this violence had its roots in the tensions between settlers and natives, but White Elk might know more. He was known for his wisdom and his ability to move between both worlds. But first, the woman needed to survive the night. Asher settled deeper into his chair, his eyes never leaving her face as he resumed his quiet prayers. The golden wedding band caught the lamplight, a reminder that this mysterious woman had a story, one that had led her to that terrible moment beneath the ponderosa pine. What forces had brought her to his mountain, and what darkness had tried to claim her life? Dawn was still hours away, and the bitter Colorado winter raged on outside the cabin walls. Inside, Asher Boone continued his watch, a solitary figure holding vigil over a stranger's life, waiting for the morning light to reveal what Providence had placed in his path. Morning crept through the gaps between the cabin logs, painting thin stripes of golden light across the rough-hewn floor. Asher stirred from his vigil, his neck stiff from sleeping upright in the wooden chair. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving only glowing embers in the hearth. A soft murmur from the bed drew his attention. The woman was moving restlessly beneath the pile of blankets, her head turning from side to side on the pillow. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't quite catch. "Nichum, help them. Please." She shifted again, her voice growing more urgent. "The rope. No time." Asher leaned forward, noting the sheen of fever on her brow. She was speaking in two tongues, English mixing with what he recognized as Ute from his dealings with the local tribe. He dipped a clean cloth in cool water, and gently pressed it to her forehead. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and bright with fever. "Water," she whispered. "Here," Asher said softly, helping her lift her head. Instead of plain water, he offered her a cup of warm broth he'd kept simmering on the stove. "Small sips now?" She drank carefully, her hands trembling too much to hold the cup herself. When she'd taken enough, she sank back against the pillow, her dark eyes studying his face with a mixture of confusion and wariness. "You're safe here," Asher said, keeping his voice gentle like he would with a spooked mare. "I found you out by the creek yesterday. Been watching over you through the night." "The hanging tree," she murmured, one hand moving to her bruised throat. Fear flickered across her face. "They'll come back. They always come back." "Who'll come? Back, ma'am?" "The vigilantes." Her voice cracked. "Same ones who killed Thomas, my husband. They dragged me from my wagon yesterday morning. Said I was a traitor for helping that Ute man escape." Asher's hand tightened on the cup he held. "You helped someone escape a hanging?" She nodded weakly. "He was innocent. They claimed he'd stolen horses, but I knew him. Tall Pine from White Elk's band. He'd traded fairly for those horses." Her eyes grew distant. "I couldn't watch them murder another innocent man. Not after Thomas." Asher stood and moved to his shelf, retrieving a worn Bible. From between its pages he pulled out a carefully folded sheet of paper, yellowed with age. Unfolding it revealed verses written in a careful hand. "My mother copied these before she passed," he said, holding the page where she could see it. Psalm 27, verse 5. "For in the time of trouble he shall hide me in his pavilion. In the secret place of his tabernacle he shall hide me." Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm Ava," she whispered. "Ava Lanier." "Asher Boone." He settled back in his chair. "Your husband, he was a Union scout?" "Yes. Thomas died last spring." Her voice grew bitter. "They said it was an accident, but I know better. He'd been asking questions about missing Indian agency supplies, medicine and food that never reached the reservation." Asher nodded slowly. He'd heard rumors of corruption at the Silver Hollow Agency. Supplies meant for the Ute disappearing into certain men's pockets. "I was the schoolteacher there," Ava continued, "and interpreter. My mother was Ute. She taught me the language, the old ways." She closed her eyes, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. "I'm 24 years old, and I've seen too many good people die for other men's greed." A racking cough seized her then, and Asher saw her wince in pain. He knew he needed to check her wrappings, the cloth he'd bound around her frost-bitten fingers and toes during the night. The thought made heat rise to his face. "Ma'am, Miss Ava," he started awkwardly. "Those bandages need changing. I can fetch the widow Bradley from down valley if you'd prefer a woman's help." "No!" Fear sharpened her voice. "Please, no one can know I'm here. Not yet." She met his eyes steadily, despite her weakness. "I trust you, Mr. Boone. The Lord led you to that tree yesterday. I reckon he knew what he was about." Asher swallowed hard, fighting his discomfort. He'd lived alone in these mountains since the war, choosing solitude over the complications of town life. Now here was this woman, half-dressed in his own shirt, trusting him with her life and modesty. With careful movements, he began unwrapping her bandaged hands. His own rough fingers trembled slightly as they brushed against her slender ones. The gold band on her finger caught the morning light, a reminder of her status as a widow, and his own as a man who'd never courted, never married. "Tell me about yourself," Ava said softly, perhaps sensing his unease. "How long have you lived up here alone?" 10 years, he answered, focusing on his task. "Since the war ended. Lost my brother at Antietam. Couldn't stomach being around people much after that. The war took so much from so many, she murmured. Her next words surprised him. But the Lord gives back in his own time, like you finding me yesterday. Asher's hands stilled for a moment. He'd spent years believing God had turned away from him, letting his prayers go unanswered. But maybe, like this wounded woman suggested, answers sometimes came in unexpected ways. He finished changing her bandages, relief flooding through him when he saw her fingers and toes were recovering from the frost. The bruising on her throat stood out starkly in the morning light, a cruel necklace that made his jaw clench with anger. Rest now, he said, pulling the blankets back up around her. You're running a fever. Sleep will help. Will you stay? Her voice was already growing drowsy. Keep watch a little longer? Yes, ma'am, he promised, settling back into his chair. Ain't going nowhere. As Ava drifted back to sleep, Asher found himself studying her face. There was strength there, beneath the fever and exhaustion. She'd faced death twice now, her husband's murder and her own near hanging, yet still spoke of God's providence. His mother would have called that true faith, the kind that endured beyond understanding. The morning light grew stronger, filtering through the cabin's chinks like streams of gold. Outside, snow continued to fall softly, covering any traces that might lead her pursuers to his door. Asher checked his rifle, then reached for his mother's Bible, finding comfort in the familiar words as he continued his quiet vigil. The blizzard descended like a white curtain, obscuring the world beyond Asher's cabin windows. Wind howled through the pines, driving snow into drifts that grew higher with each passing hour. Inside, the fire crackled steadily, casting warm light across the rough-hewn walls. Asher added another log to the flames, careful not to let them burn too low. He'd learned that lesson his first winter in the high country, how quickly cold could seep into a man's bones when the fire died. A pot of venison stew simmered on the iron stove, filling the cabin with rich, savory scents. From her place in his bed, Ava watched him move about the cabin. Color had begun returning to her cheeks, though shadows still lingered beneath her eyes. You don't have to keep nursing me, she said softly. I can manage. Ain't proper to let a lady fend for herself in weather like this. Asher checked the stew, stirring it with a wooden spoon. Besides, Storm's got us both trapped here for now. He ladled the stew into 2 tin bowls, adding a chunk of sourdough bread beside each portion. The bread was 3 days old now, but still good when dipped in the broth. Carrying the bowls to the bed, he helped Ava sit up against the headboard. Tell me about Silver Hollow, he said, settling into his chair with his own bowl. Been meaning to ride down that way, but never seemed to find the time. Ava's hands trembled slightly as she held her spoon. It's grown since the mill opened. Silas Hodge brought machinery up from Denver last spring, said he was bringing progress to the territory. Her voice hardened. What he really brought was trouble. Hodge, he's the one behind what happened to you? She nodded, taking a careful sip of broth. Him and his men. They call themselves the Citizens Committee for Progress, but they're nothing but hired thugs. They've been pushing the Ute off their hunting grounds, claiming the land for timber rights. She paused, pain flickering across her face. Thomas started investigating them before he died, said something wasn't right about how they got their contracts. Outside, the wind rose to a keening wail. Asher stood and moved to the window, brushing frost from the glass to peer out at the swirling white. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Need to check my trap lines, he said, more to himself than to Ava. Make sure they don't get buried too deep. Will you be safe out there? The concern in her voice made something twist in his chest. Done it 100 times before. Won't go far. He bundled up in his heaviest coat and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he welcomed it. 3 days of sharing his small cabin with a woman had left him feeling oddly unsettled. Out here, with snow stinging his face and wind tugging at his clothes, he could think clearly again. The great pine where he'd found her stood like a dark sentinel against the white sky. Asher trudged toward it, following the path he'd made earlier. Beneath its branches, sheltered somewhat from the storm, he dropped to his knees in the snow. Prayer had never come easy to him, not since watching his brother die at Antietam. But something about finding Ava, about seeing her faith despite everything she'd endured, stirred something long dormant in his soul. He bowed his head, letting the silence speak for him. When he returned to the cabin, cheeks raw from the cold, Ava was dozing fitfully. Her face was troubled, hands clutching at the blankets. As he watched, she began to thrash, crying out in her sleep. "No, please, the rope, can't breathe." Asher moved quickly to her side, catching her flailing hands in his. "You're safe," he said firmly. "Ain't no rope here, just dreams." Her eyes flew open, wild with remembered terror. For a long moment she stared at him, chest heaving. Then recognition dawned, and she sagged back against the pillows. "Sorry," she whispered. "The dreams, they feel so real." "No need to apologize." He released her hands carefully, aware of how improper their position might appear to others. But there were no others here. Just them and the howling storm. The blizzard lasted 3 days. Asher fell into a routine, tending the fire, melting snow for water, checking his traps when the wind died down enough to venture out. Each morning, he changed Ava's bandages with trembling fingers, fighting both his own inexperience and the strange warmth that bloomed in his chest when she smiled at him. They talked during the long hours of confinement. Ava told him more about Silver Hollow, about teaching at the Indian Agency School before it closed. She spoke of her mother's people, the Ute traditions she'd learned alongside her reading and writing. "My father was a trader," she explained one evening over bowls of stew. "He loved my mother enough to defy everyone who said they shouldn't marry. When he died, she made sure I knew both worlds, her people's wisdom and the settlers' education." Sounds like a strong woman. She was. Ava's smile held both pride and sadness. "She died before I married Thomas. Would have warned me, I think, about the dangers of asking too many questions in a place like Silver Hollow." On the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally broke. Sunshine speared through the cabin windows, making the fresh snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. Ava stood at the window, wrapped in one of Asher's old blankets. "I need to leave today," she said quietly. Asher looked up from where he was banking the fire. "You ain't fully healed yet." "Healed enough." She turned to face him, determination written across her features. "There's something I need to do. Something I need to bury beneath that pine where you found me." "What thing?" She shook her head. "Better you don't know. But it needs doing. And soon, before Hodge's men start searching the high country again." Asher wanted to argue, to insist she stay until her strength fully returned. But he recognized the steel in her voice, the same determination that had led her to risk her life saving that Ute man from hanging. "At least let me help," he said finally. "Watch your back while you do what needs doing." Gratitude softened her expression. "You've already done more than most would, Mr. Boone. I won't put you in more danger." "Reckon I put myself there when I cut you down." He met her gaze steadily. "Ain't about to walk away now." The morning sun had barely cleared the mountains when they made their way to the pine tree. Ava moved slowly, still weak from her ordeal, but she refused Asher's offer of help. At the base of the great tree, she knelt in the snow, reaching into the pocket of the coat he'd lent her. Asher kept watch, rifle ready, as she worked. He didn't ask what she was burying. Some questions were better left unasked. But he noticed how her hands shook as she covered whatever it was with snow and fallen needles. When she finished, she remained kneeling for a moment, head bowed. Her lips moved in what might have been prayer. Then she struggled to her feet, face pale but determined. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything." Asher nodded, unable to find words for the mixture of emotions churning in his chest. 3 days ago, she'd been a stranger he'd cut down from this very tree. Now he wasn't sure what she was to him. But watching her stand there in the morning light, strength and vulnerability mingled in her bearing, he knew his life would never be quite the same. Through the crisp morning air, Asher and Ava made their way back to the towering pine. The sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the pristine snow. Ava's steps were measured but determined, though Asher noticed how she pressed one hand against her side, still tender from her ordeal. "Here," she said, stopping at the base of the great tree. "Help me clear this snow." Together they scraped away the fresh powder until they reached harder-packed earth. Ava pulled a small hunting knife from her boot, one Asher had lent her, and began carefully digging between two massive roots. Her movements were precise, deliberate, as if she'd memorized the exact spot. Thomas knew they might come for him, she explained, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. He was careful about where he hid things. The knife struck something solid. Ava's hands trembled slightly as she worked the object free from the frozen soil. It was a small oilskin package, bound with twine. Inside, wrapped carefully to protect against moisture, lay a leather-bound journal and a silver locket. Asher kept watch while she opened the journal, its pages crackling in the morning quiet. Her eyes moved quickly across the neat handwriting within. "Thomas was thorough," she said softly. "He documented everything. Dates, witnesses, copies of the original deeds. Silas Hodge has been forging documents, pushing the Ute off their granted grazing lands piece by piece." She looked up at Asher, her dark eyes fierce. "The territorial governor gave those lands to the Ute in the treaty, but Hodge has been claiming their unclaimed territory, selling timber rights to himself through shell companies." "That's why your husband was killed?" Asher asked, though he already knew the answer. Ava nodded, carefully rewrapping the journal. "Thomas was going to take this to Denver, to the federal marshal there, but someone must have warned Hodge." Her voice caught. "I found him in our barn the next morning. They made it look like a riding accident, but I knew better." She opened the locket, revealing a small daguerreotype inside, a younger version of herself standing beside a tall man in a Union uniform. Thomas Lanier's face was serious but kind, his hand resting protectively on his wife's shoulder. "I kept teaching at the agency school, trying to act normal while I gathered more evidence," she continued. "But then last week, I couldn't stand by and watch them hang Walking Fox for a crime he didn't commit. After I helped him escape..." She closed the locket with a snap. "Well, you know the rest." The crack of a branch echoing through the trees cut their conversation short. Asher's head snapped up, his hunter's instincts alert. In the distance, the distinctive sound of hoofbeats grew closer. "Quick," he whispered, pulling Ava toward a deep snowdrift beneath a cluster of young pines. "Stay low." They pressed themselves into the snow, Ava clutching the precious package to her chest. Asher eased his rifle from his shoulder, keeping it ready but hidden. The riders came into view through the trees, 3 men, heavily armed, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air. Asher recognized the type. Hired guns, the kind who asked no questions as long as the pay was good. They rode slowly, scanning the ground and trees with practiced eyes. "Tracks lead this way," one called out, pointing toward Asher's cabin in the distance. "Fresh ones." "Check them," ordered another, his voice carrying authority. "Hodge wants proof she's dead this time." Ava's breath caught. Asher placed a steadying hand on her arm, willing her to stay still. The snow around them was unmarked. Their earlier tracks to the pine were already filled in by the morning's light snowfall. The riders continued past their hiding place, following the more obvious trail toward the cabin. Asher and Ava remained motionless until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. "They'll find the cabin," Asher said quietly. "And know someone's been living there," Ava finished. "I'm sorry. I've brought trouble to your door." Asher shook his head. "Ain't your fault, but we need to move. They'll be back this way soon enough." He helped her to her feet, brushing snow from her coat. "I reckon it's time I paid a visit to Silver Hollow." Surprise flickered across her face. "You don't have to do that. You've risked enough already." "A man can't sit quiet when he knows about evil being done," Asher said, the words coming slowly but with conviction. "My pa taught me that much before he died. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "been needing supplies anyway." They moved quickly but carefully back to the cabin, staying under cover of the trees. Inside, Asher gathered what food he could spare: jerked venison, dried beans, and his precious store of coffee. He wrapped it all in an old blanket while Ava kept watch at the window. "Hiram ain't much to look at," he said as he led his mule from the lean-to shelter, "but he's sure-footed in the snow and stubborn as they come." He secured their supplies and helped Ava mount, noting how she winced at the movement. "We'll have to share him, but he's strong enough for two." "What about your trap lines?" Ava asked, as Asher swung up behind her. "They'll keep." He clicked his tongue, urging Hiram forward. "Some things matter more than pelts." They set out away from the cabin, taking a roundabout route to avoid the riders' tracks. Asher kept them under the cover of the forest where possible, alert for any sign of pursuit. The mule picked his way carefully through the snow, his long ears swiveling at every sound. Ava sat straight in front of him, one hand holding the pommel. The other pressed protectively over the hidden package inside her coat. Though she said nothing, Asher could feel the tension in her body, the way she startled at unexpected sounds. "2 days to Silver Hollow," he said quietly, trying to distract her from her fears. "Maybe 3, depending on the snow. We'll stick to the high ground where we can. Keep watch for riders." She nodded, then spoke so softly he almost missed it. "Thank you, Mr. Boone." "Asher," he corrected gently. "Reckon we're past formalities, given everything." "Asher," she repeated, and though he couldn't see her face, he heard the small smile in her voice. "I still don't know why you're doing all this for a stranger." He was quiet for a long moment, considering. The mule's steady gait and the crunch of snow filled the silence. "Maybe because I've spent too long up here alone," he finally said. "Or maybe because sometimes the Lord puts a clear choice in front of a man. Do what's right or walk away. And I've done too much walking away in my life." They continued on through the winter forest, the sun climbing higher overhead. Behind them, somewhere in the distance, 3 riders searched an empty cabin, finding only cold ashes in the hearth and tracks in the snow that led everywhere and nowhere at once. The winter sun cast long shadows through the canyon walls as they picked their way along the narrow trail. Hiram's hooves crunched steadily through the crusty snow, his breath coming in white puffs. Ava shifted uncomfortably in the saddle, still unused to the rhythmic motion after 2 days of riding. "Here," Asher said quietly, reaching around to adjust her grip on the pommel. "Keep your back straight, but don't fight the movement. Let your hips follow the mule's gait." Ava nodded, trying to mirror his posture. "I was never much for riding," she admitted. "At the agency school, I walked everywhere." "Hiram's teaching you well enough," Asher replied. "He's got more patience than most schoolmasters I've known." As if in agreement, the mule's ears flicked back at the sound of his name. Ava laughed softly, the first real laugh Asher had heard from her. The sound echoed briefly off the canyon walls before being swallowed by the snow. They made camp that evening in a sheltered hollow near a half-frozen river. The water still moved beneath a thin sheet of ice, its quiet gurgling a constant whisper in the gathering dusk. Asher helped Ava dismount, noting how she was steadier on her feet now, though she still winced at the movement. "Best gather wood while there's light," he said, scanning the area. "I'll show you something useful." They collected fallen branches together, Asher pointing out the driest pieces hidden under snowdrifts. When they had a good pile, he pulled out his knife and began shaving thin curls from a piece of cedar. "Watch close," he instructed. "Sometimes matches get wet or run out, but if you know what you're doing, the forest provides." He arranged the cedar shavings in a small nest, surrounded by progressively larger twigs. From his pocket, he produced a piece of flint and a steel striker. "The secret's in the preparation," he explained, demonstrating how to position the tinder. "Make your spark count." The flint struck true, sending a shower of sparks into the cedar shavings. A tiny flame took hold, and Asher carefully fed it with smaller twigs until it grew strong enough for larger pieces. Ava watched intently, then tried it herself with another piece of cedar. It took several attempts, but finally, a spark caught. Her face lit up with quiet triumph as she nursed the flame to life. "There," Asher said approvingly. "Now you'll never be without warmth, long as you got these." He handed her the flint and steel. "Keep them dry, they'll serve you well." They shared a simple meal of beans and jerky, watching the flames dance and listening to the river's whispered song. The stars emerged one by one overhead, brilliant in the clear mountain air. Ava wrapped herself tighter in her borrowed blanket, staring into the fire. "Why did you stop praying out loud?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Asher was quiet for a long moment, feeding another stick to the flames. "After my brother died at Gettysburg," he finally said, "I got angry at God. Figured he wasn't listening anyway, so why waste breath on words?" He poked at the fire, sending sparks skyward. "I still pray, mind you, just differently now, in the quiet places." "Like under the pine tree," Ava observed. He nodded. "Used to pray for a wife, years back, someone to share the seasons with, work the land." A sad smile touched his lips. "Even had a cabin site picked out, down near Silver Creek. But after Jacob died, I just lost heart for it. Came up here instead, where the only thing that needed tending was trap lines." The fire crackled between them, filling the thoughtful silence. "I prayed for mercy," Ava said softly, her hand unconsciously touching the fading bruises on her neck. "That night, under the tree. I couldn't feel my feet anymore, could barely breathe, but I prayed. And then..." She looked at him across the flames. "And then there was a stranger with a knife, cutting me down. Someone who didn't walk away." Their eyes met briefly before Asher looked down, uncomfortable with the intensity of her gaze. "Any decent man would have done the same," he mumbled. "Would they?" Ava's voice held a gentle challenge. "3 riders passed us today who wouldn't have. The men who strung me up didn't. Sometimes mercy wears ordinary skin, Asher. Sometimes it looks like a trapper who's forgotten how to pray out loud." He had no answer for that, so he busied himself banking the fire for the night. They settled down to sleep on opposite sides of the flames, wrapped in blankets against the cold. The river continued its ice-muffled song, and somewhere in the darkness, a great horned owl called once, twice, then fell silent. Dawn found them moving again, Hiram picking his way carefully along the trail as it wound down from the high country. The air grew slightly warmer as they lost elevation, though winter still held firm grip on the land. By mid-afternoon, they caught their first glimpse of Silver Hollow through a gap in the trees, smoke rising from scattered chimneys, the glint of sun on the mill's metal roof. Ava's body tensed. Asher felt it immediately, the way she stiffened in the saddle. "They'll remember me," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Everyone in town will know my face." Asher drew Hiram to a halt, considering the settlement below. After a moment, he said quietly, "Then let him remember wrong is right." "What do you mean?" "Way I see it, they've got a choice to make, same as I did under that pine tree. They can face what's true, or they can keep believing the lie that lets them sleep at night." His voice grew firmer. "But truth has a way of coming out, like a spring thaw. Can't stop it forever." "Even if it costs them everything they've built?" Ava asked. "Especially then," Asher replied. "A house built on stolen land, using stolen lives. That ain't no true home, just a pretty cage for the soul." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Your husband knew that. Reckon that's why he kept such careful records." Ava's hand pressed against her coat, where the journal lay hidden. "He believed in justice," she said softly, "even when it hurt." "Then we owe it to him to see it through," Asher said, "whatever comes after." They sat there a moment longer, watching the smoke rise from distant chimneys. Then Ava straightened in the saddle, squaring her shoulders. "You're right," she said, her voice stronger now. "Truth is like spring thaw, and it's time for winter to end in Silver Hollow." Asher clicked his tongue, and Hiram started forward again, picking his way down the slope. The sun was westering now, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. As they descended, Asher found himself praying again, not in words, but in the quiet of his heart. Not for escape or safety, but for the strength to face whatever waited in the town below. And for the first time in years, he felt certain those prayers were heard. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Hollow's main street as Asher and Ava approached the town limits. Hiram's hooves crunched steadily through the crusty snow, each step bringing them closer to the collection of wooden buildings and smoking chimneys. The familiar sight of the town made Ava's hands tighten on Asher's coat. A woman sweeping her porch dropped her broom with a clatter. A group of men loading a wagon stopped mid-task, their faces going slack with disbelief. One by one, townspeople froze in their tracks as they recognized the rider behind the mountain man. "Lord have mercy," someone whispered. "It's the widow Lanier." The words rippled through the street like a stone dropped in still water. Doors creaked open. Faces appeared in windows, and the whispers grew louder, more venomous. "Half-breed witch," hissed a woman, pulling her children closer. "Heathen's bride," muttered another, making the sign of the cross. Asher felt Ava's grip tighten further. "Hold steady," he murmured. "Their words can't touch you now." They passed the general store, where the proprietor hastily pulled down his shutters. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. Even the usual sounds of the mill were muted, as if the whole town held its breath at their arrival. Near the livery stable, Pastor Elijah Cray stood waiting, his black coat stark against the snow. His eyes were hard as river stones as he watched them approach, Bible clutched tight in his weathered hands. "You were not expected to return, Mrs. Lanier," he said, voice carrying clearly in the hushed street. "We thought the Lord had passed his judgment." "The Lord's judgment and man's are not always the same, Pastor," Ava replied steadily. "I need to speak with Sheriff Hodge." "The sheriff's office is closed to your kind," Cray declared. "This is a God-fearing town. We don't welcome those who consort with heathens and murderers." Asher dismounted in one fluid motion, positioning himself between Ava and the pastor. Though he stood a head taller than Cray, his voice remained quiet. "Seems to me, Pastor, you might want to read that good book again, particularly the parts about bearing false witness." A muscle twitched in Cray's jaw. "You don't know our history with her, stranger. Don't presume to judge what you don't understand." "I understand plenty," Asher replied. "I understand the rope burns on her neck. I understand the sign they hung on her, and I reckon God understands too." The tension crackled between them like static before a storm. A small crowd had gathered, maintaining a cautious distance, but eager to witness the confrontation. Cray's knuckles whitened around his Bible. "The sheriff's office remains closed," he repeated firmly. "I suggest you both leave town before sunset. Silver Hollow has no room for troublemakers." As they led Hiram toward the telegraph office to inquire about lodging, a thin young clerk darted out the door. He pressed a folded paper into Asher's hand before hurrying back inside. In the shadow of the building's eave, Asher read the hastily scrawled warning, "Leave before nightfall. Hodge runs this town." Ava touched his arm. "I know a place," she said softly. "My old cabin. It's on the edge of town, but—" She trailed off, uncertainty crossing her face. They found the cabin as the sun dipped toward the mountains. The walls still stood, but the roof had partially collapsed, and scorch marks blackened the logs. Snow had drifted through the gaps, creating small dunes on the dirt floor. The hearth was cold, filled with old ashes and broken dreams. Asher surveyed the damage with a practiced eye. "We can make this work for tonight," he said, already moving to clear debris. "First thing is getting a fire. Going. These walls will hold heat once we patch the bigger holes." He worked steadily as twilight gathered, using fallen branches and snow-laden pine boughs to create a makeshift roof over one corner. Ava gathered what dry wood she could find, watching as he rebuilt the hearth stone by stone. "They burned it the night after they hanged me," she said quietly, running her hand along a scorched wall. "Said they were cleansing the town of evil." Her voice caught. "This was our home. Thomas and we were happy here." Asher paused in his work, watching as she knelt beside the half-rebuilt hearth. Her fingers traced the blackened stones, and then, to his surprise, she began to pray. "Lord," she whispered, "give me strength to forgive them, not because they deserve it, but because hatred is too heavy to carry anymore." Her voice grew stronger. "Help me remember that you saved me for a purpose, that justice and mercy can walk hand in hand." Asher stood motionless, struck by the raw honesty of her words. This wasn't the formal prayer of church services, but something deeper, a soul laying itself bare before God. He found himself adding his own silent plea, for wisdom, for courage, for the strength to see this through. The last light faded from the sky as Asher coaxed a small fire to life in the restored hearth. Its warm glow pushed back the shadows, creating a pocket of light in the wounded cabin. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant church bells tolling the evening hour. Ava sat close to the fire, her face thoughtful in the flickering light. "They're afraid," she said finally. "Not just of me, but of what I represent. Change, truth, the end of their comfortable lies." Asher nodded, adding another stick to the flames. "Fear makes people cruel, makes them forget their own humanity." He glanced at her. "But you haven't forgotten yours. That prayer, That was something real. I learned it from the Ute, she replied. They say forgiveness isn't about forgetting the wound, but about not letting it poison your spirit. She pulled her husband's journal from her coat, holding it carefully. Thomas understood that too. He wanted justice, yes, but not revenge. He believed there was a better way. The fire popped and sparked, sending embers dancing upward through the gaps in the makeshift roof. Outside, Silver Hollow settled into an uneasy night, its windows glowing with lamplight, its streets empty of all but shadows and whispered fears. In the burned cabin, Asher and Ava sat in companionable silence, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind's lonely song. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, they had shelter, warmth, and the quiet strength of prayers spoken into darkness, carrying hope for dawn. The lamp cast wavering shadows on the cabin's damaged walls as Asher settled near the hearth. His weathered hands carefully opened Thomas Lanier's journal, its leather cover worn smooth from frequent handling. Ava sat, close, her shoulder barely touching his, as she watched him turn to the first page. Thomas kept detailed records, she said softly. He believed writing truth could change hearts. Asher nodded, squinting at the neat script. The flickering light made the words dance across the page, but the meaning was clear enough. He read aloud, his voice low and steady. April 15th, 1877. Witnessed Silas Hodge meeting with James Carson from the land office. Money changed hands. $500 in banknotes. Carson promised to lose the Ute grazing rights documentation. God help me, I saw it all from behind Miller's store. Ava's hands twisted in her lap. That was just the beginning. Keep reading. Asher turned several pages, stopping at an entry that made his breath catch. May 2nd. Hodge's men drove Ute horses from their winter pasture today. When White Elk protested, they beat him. Sheriff watched, did nothing. This town's justice has been bought and paid for, same as those land titles. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, wind moaned through the gaps in the walls, carrying winter's bite. Asher continued reading, his voice growing grimmer with each entry. June 20th. Found proof today. Hodge forged documents dating back 3 years. Changed boundary lines, erased Ute markers. The territorial marshal needs to see these papers. I'm sending copies to Denver next week. Ava made a small sound, like something breaking in her chest. He never got the chance, she whispered. 3 days later, they found him by the creek. Asher's hand tightened on the journal. The next entry was in different handwriting, Ava's, written in a shaky scrawl. June 24th. They say Thomas drowned, but I saw the bruises on his throat, same as the rope marks on White Elk. Hodge's men were watching our cabin all week. They knew Thomas had evidence. Dear God, give me strength to finish what he started. Tears slid down Ava's cheeks, catching the lamplight. I tried to warn the other families, tried to get word to the Ute camp about the forged deeds, but Hodge's men caught White Elk before he could reach his people. Her voice cracked. They hanged him while the town watched. Then they came for me. Asher set the journal down, his jaw tight with anger. The enormity of what they'd uncovered settled over him like a heavy snow. This wasn't just about stolen land or murdered men. It was about a whole town twisted by greed and fear, choosing silence over truth. The territorial marshal needs to see this, he said firmly. All of it. The forged deeds, the bribes, the killings. Man like Hodge, he won't stop until someone makes him. Ava wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. We'll have to leave at first light. Once Hodge knows I'm alive and the journal's been found. A sudden movement outside caught Asher's attention. He held up his hand, signaling silence. Through the broken window, he spotted dark shapes moving against the trees. 2 riders, their silhouettes stark against the snow. "Don't move," he whispered, slowly reaching for his rifle. The Winchester was a comfortable weight in his hands, its stock polished smooth from years of use. "They're watching the cabin." Ava's breath hitched, but she stayed perfectly still. With careful movements, Asher extinguished the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness broken only by the hearth's dim glow. The shadows outside shifted, drawing closer. "The journal," Ava breathed. "We can't let them find it." Working by touch in the near darkness, they lifted the hearthstones. The fire's dying light showed a shallow space beneath, just deep enough to hide the leather-bound book. Ava tucked it carefully away while Asher replaced the stones, making sure they lay flat. The riders circled the cabin once, their horses' hooves muffled by snow. Asher kept his rifle trained on the door, finger steady near the trigger. But after several tense minutes, the sounds moved away, fading into the night. "They'll be back," Asher said quietly, still watching the window. "Probably with more men." Ava nodded, her face pale in the fading firelight. She pulled her Bible from her coat pocket, a small worn volume with pages dog-eared from frequent reading. As she clutched it to her chest, Asher saw her lips moving in silent prayer. He settled with his back against the wall, rifle across his knees, preparing for a long night. The fire burned low, casting just enough light to watch the door and windows. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind might herald danger. Ava curled up near the hearth, still holding her Bible. Despite the tension, exhaustion eventually pulled her into uneasy sleep. Asher watched her breathing steady, struck by how young she looked in repose and how much weight she carried on her shoulders. The night stretched on, marked by the slow wheeling of stars visible through the damaged roof. Asher kept his vigil, thoughts turning to the evidence hidden beneath the hearthstones. The journal represented more than just proof of crimes. It was Thomas Lanier's legacy, his final attempt to bring justice to a corrupted town. Now that task had fallen to them, a widow who refused to die, and a mountain man who couldn't walk away. The truth they carried could shatter Silas Hodge's empire of lies, but first they had to survive until dawn. Outside, snow began to fall, thick flakes drifting through the broken window. Asher pulled his coat tighter, checking his rifle's action for the 100th time. His finger never strayed far from the trigger as he watched shadows move in the darkness, waiting for morning's light. The bitter dawn crept over Silver Hollow, painting the frost-covered buildings in shades of pearl and gold. Sunday's stillness wrapped the town like a shroud, broken only by the deep, resonant toll of the church bell echoing through the valley. Asher stood in the cabin's doorway, adjusting his cleanest shirt collar. Usual comfortable buckskins felt out of place against the starched cotton, but proper church clothes weren't something he'd thought to pack for trapping season. "We don't have to go," Ava said softly behind him. She'd managed to smooth her dark hair and mend the worst tears in her dress, though the rope burns on her neck still showed above her collar. "Yes, we do." Asher's voice was gentle but firm. "Hiding makes us look guilty. Best way to face down lies is to stand in plain sight." The bell tolled again, calling the faithful to worship. Asher offered Ava his arm, the gesture awkward but sincere. Together they walked down the town's main street, their boots crunching on fresh snow. Townsfolk hurried past them, averting their eyes or staring openly, depending on their courage. The white-painted church stood proud against the mountain backdrop, its spire reaching toward heaven like a finger pointing the way. As they climbed the steps, Asher felt Ava's hand tighten on his arm. He covered it briefly with his own, a silent promise of protection. Inside, The pewter light filtering through frosted windows cast long shadows across worn floorboards. The congregation fell silent as they entered, heads turning like prairie grass in a storm wind. Asher guided Ava to an empty pew near the back, positioning himself between her and the aisle. Pastor Cray stood at the pulpit, his severe face carved deeper by the angled light. His eyes found them immediately, narrowing with barely concealed distaste. The opening hymn died away, and he cleared his throat with deliberate force. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary, "today we examine the nature of temptation and the filth that seeks to corrupt God's chosen people." Asher felt Ava stiffen beside him. The sermon that followed was a masterwork of veiled accusation, each carefully chosen scripture twisted into a weapon. Cray's gaze returned to them again and again as he spoke of foreign ways and those who would lead the righteous astray. "Remember that Satan appears as an angel of light," Cray thundered, staring directly at their pew. "The devil clothes sin in beauty to deceive the unwary." Asher's jaw tightened, but he held himself still. He'd faced down mountain lions with less intensity than it took to meet that sanctimonious glare without flinching. Beside him, Ava's lips moved in silent prayer. Not in fear, he realized, but in petition for the man condemning her. The service seemed endless, but finally the last hymn faded, and the congregation began to file out. As they stood to leave, a smooth voice cut through the general murmur. "Mr. Boone, a moment if you please." Silas Hodge approached with the easy confidence of a man used to deference. His Sunday suit was Denver-tailored, his smile practiced and pleasant, but his eyes were cold as mountain water. "I've heard so much about you," Hodge said, extending his hand. "A man of the wilderness, living by his own code. Admirable." Asher took the offered hand briefly, noting the soft palm and manicured nails. "Much obliged," he said neutrally. "I'd be honored if you'd join me for supper this evening," Hodge continued. "Just us men, sharing thoughts on the territory's future. Say around 6 o'clock?" Before Asher could respond, Ava's fingers dug into his arm. Her face remained calm, but fear radiated from her like heat from a stove. "Don't go," she whispered when they were outside. "Please. His hospitality always has hooks in it." Asher watched Hodge's retreating back, considering. "Sometimes you need to know your enemy face to face," he said finally. "I'll be careful." The day passed slowly. Asher spent it repairing more of the cabin's damage, while Ava paced and prayed. As the winter sun settled toward the mountains, he cleaned up and headed into town. Hodge's house stood apart from the others, a 2-story monument to prosperity with actual glass windows and painted trim. A house servant showed Asher to a study where a fire blazed in a brick hearth. The room smelled of leather and tobacco, with a hint of something sharper underneath. "Ah, Mr. Boone!" Hodge rose from behind a massive desk. "Right on time. Please, make yourself comfortable." The next hour was an exercise in careful conversation over surprisingly good stew and expensive brandy. Hodge spoke of progress, of civilization pushing back the wilderness, of order replacing chaos. His words were smooth as creek stones, but Asher caught the current of threat running beneath them. "You know, I admire your way of life," Hodge said, refilling Asher's barely touched glass. "The solitude, the simplicity, no complications, no entanglements." He paused meaningfully. "It would be a shame to sully that with unfortunate associations." Asher set his glass down carefully. "Meaning what, exactly?" Hodge's pleasant mask slipped, showing something ugly beneath. "You think she's clean?" he sneered. "Ask what she is, what blood runs in her veins. Ask yourself if a God-fearing man should mix with—" The rest of his words vanished in the roar filling Asher's ears. His hands curled into fists, knuckles white with the effort of restraint. Everything in him yearned to smash that superior smile, to make this snake of a man taste blood and dirt. Instead, he stood slowly, deliberately. Without a word, he turned his back on Hodge and walked out, each step measured and controlled. His hands trembled, but they remained clean of violence. The night air helped clear his head as he made his way back to the cabin. He found Ava sitting by the repaired hearth, reading her Bible by lamplight. She looked up as he entered, concern written across her face. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Asher knelt beside her, his voice rough with emotion. "You listen to me now," he said. "What men say don't matter. Their judgment ain't worth the air it rides on. You're safe in God's eyes. That's all that counts." Tears welled in Ava's eyes, but they were different from her earlier ones. Cleansing rather than grieving. She reached out hesitantly and touched his hand, the gesture light as a snowflake, but warm as summer rain. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me as I am, not what they say I am." Asher covered her hand with his, marveling at how such a simple touch could anchor a soul. In that moment, he understood that true strength wasn't in the blows he'd held back, but in the grace he chose to give instead. The fire crackled softly, casting their shadows on the wall, not separate now, but intertwined, like branches growing toward the light. Outside, the wind sang through the pines, carrying winter's whispered promise that even the longest night must yield to dawn. The wind howled through Silver Hollow Valley like a wounded beast, rattling window panes and tearing at loose shingles. 2 nights had passed since the confrontation with Silas, and the weather matched their unsettled spirits. Asher worked steadily at splitting wood behind the cabin, his axe biting deep into pine logs. The physical labor helped quiet his mind, though his thoughts kept circling back to Ava's safety. The temperature had dropped sharper than usual, and the cabin's repaired hearth demanded constant feeding. Sweat froze on his brow as he gathered another armload of split wood. The setting sun painted the clouds crimson, a color that made him uneasy. He'd seen such skies before bad storms, but something else nagged at his instincts, a wrongness in the air that had nothing to do with weather. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a smell that made his heart stop. Smoke. Not the clean scent of chimney fires, but the acrid stench of destruction. Dropping the wood, Asher sprinted around the cabin's corner. Horror struck him like a physical blow. Flames already climbed the cabin's north wall, greedily consuming the dry timber. Orange light danced in the broken windows, and dark smoke billowed into the twilight sky. "Ava!" His shout was nearly lost in the wind and the fire's roar. Without hesitation, he charged toward the burning building. Heat slammed into him as he shouldered through the door. Smoke filled his lungs, making him cough violently. Through watering eyes, he spotted Ava crumpled near the hearth, coughing and trying to crawl toward the door. "Hold on!" He reached her in 3 long strides, scooping her into his arms. A sudden crack of gunfire split the air. Pain blazed across his shoulder, hot and sharp. He stumbled but kept his feet, clutching Ava tighter. They burst out of the cabin into the biting wind. Asher didn't stop until they reached the shelter of a large spruce 30 yards away. As he set Ava down, he caught glimpses of dark shapes moving through the trees, horsemen melting into the gathering darkness. Silas's men, no doubt about their work. "The journal," Ava gasped between coughs. "They must have—" She broke off, horror dawning on her face. "They took it. While the fire— They must have—" Asher pressed her head against his chest, shielding her from having to watch as her home burned for the 2nd time. His shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but he ignored it. The pain in his heart was far worse, watching helplessly as the flames devoured everything they'd worked to rebuild. Hours passed. The fire burned hot and fast, fed by the dry winter air and relentless wind. They could only watch as the roof collapsed inward with a shower of sparks that rose like angry fireflies into the night sky. Ava's sobs had quieted to silent tears that froze on her cheeks. "It's my fault," she whispered finally. "Everything I touch turns to ash. I should never have stayed, never dragged you into this." "Don't," Asher said firmly, though his voice shook slightly. "Evil men did this, not you. The sin's on their heads, not yours." The wind died as night deepened, leaving only the crack and pop of burning timber. Asher's shoulder had gone from sharp pain to a deep, insistent throb. He knew he should tend to it, but he couldn't bring himself to release Ava. She seemed so small against him, yet he felt the steel in her spine even as she trembled. They stayed there until false dawn began to pale the eastern sky. The cabin had burned down to glowing embers, sullen red eyes in a bed of gray ash. The bitter cold had settled in fully, making their breath cloud white in the pre-morning gloom. "We should see what's left," Ava said quietly. Her voice was hoarse from smoke and crying, but steadier now. Together they picked their way through the smoking ruins. The heat still radiated from the ashes, making the snow around the foundation steam. Little remained recognizable. A few blackened cooking pots, the twisted remains of the iron stove, half-melted glass from the windows. Ava's Bible had survived partially, protected by falling beneath a collapsed section of flooring, though its pages were scorched and waterlogged. They gathered what little they could salvage into a small pile. Asher's shoulder protested every movement, but he worked alongside Ava without complaint. When they had collected everything worth saving, they dug through the frozen ground beneath a young aspen tree. "A proper burial," Ava said softly, laying her ruined Bible and the few recovered possessions in the shallow hole. "Like for people, so for the pieces of their lives." They covered everything with earth, then snow. Asher stood silent for a moment, then spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Lord," he began, the words coming slowly, uncertainly. "You know our hearts. You see what's been done here." His voice caught, then strengthened. "We ask for peace even in these ashes, strength to face what comes, and—" He hesitated, then finished firmly. "Justice, in your time, not ours." "Amen," Ava whispered, squeezing his hand. The sun had properly risen by then, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of pink and gold. It would have been beautiful if not for the smoking ruin behind them and the weight of loss in their hearts. They were gathering what supplies remained when they heard horses approaching. Asher reached for his rifle, but it was only Tom Wesley, the telegraph operator who had warned them days before. His horse was lathered despite the cold, showing how hard he'd ridden. "Thank the Lord you're both alive," he gasped, dismounting quickly. "Word's all over town about the fire, but that's not the worst." He paused, catching his breath. "Silas is at the sheriff's office right now. He's got the journal, claims Ava stole it from his safe. He's charging her with treason against the territory for conspiring with hostiles against legal land claims." Tom's face was grave as he continued. "They're forming a posse. Silas is calling for a proper hanging this time, says he'll see justice done in the light of day." Ava swayed slightly, and Asher steadied her with his good arm. Her face had gone pale, but her voice was surprisingly calm when she spoke. "How long?" "They'll ride out by noon," Tom replied. "Maybe 20 men. Silas has been preparing for this. Got the sheriff convinced and half the town riled up about Indian sympathizers threatening their claims." Asher's mind raced, calculating distances and options. The nearest marshal's office was 4 days' hard ride. The Ute winter camps were closer, but reaching them meant crossing the high country in dangerous weather. And now his wounded shoulder complicated everything. He looked down at Ava, seeing not fear in her eyes, but a quiet resolution that made his heart ache. She had survived so much already. He would not let them hang her, not while he drew breath. The wind picked up again, carrying the smell of smoke and the promise of more snow. Behind them, the last embers of their shelter flickered and died, leaving only ashes to mark what had briefly been a place of hope and healing. Dawn painted silver streaks across the morning sky as Asher scouted the wagon tracks leading east from Silver Hollow. His breath clouded in the bitter air while he studied the ground, searching for the safest route out of the territory. They needed to leave before Silas could gather his men. The crack of a branch made him spin. Too late. 5 riders emerged from the trees, rifles raised. He recognized Wade Morton, Silas's foreman, by his distinctive red beard. "Ain't personal, mountain man," Wade called out, "but you picked the wrong side." Asher's hand inched toward his gun. A rifle shot kicked up snow by his feet. "Don't," Wade warned. "Boss wants words with you, that's all." Like he had words with Ava's husband? Asher's voice was quiet, but sharp as steel. The men circled closer. Asher counted his chances, 5 to 1, all armed. His shoulder wound still ached, but he couldn't let them take him. Ava was waiting. He dove for cover as the first punch came, managing to land a solid blow that sent one man sprawling. But then something hard crashed, against the back of his head. The world tilted sideways. Through blurring vision, he saw boots approaching. Pain exploded across his ribs. Again. Again. "Enough!" Wade's voice seemed to come from far away. "Leave him. We got what we came for." Darkness swallowed him. The pain dragged him back to consciousness. Dusk had painted the snow purple, and his blood made dark patches in the white. Every breath was agony. He tried to stand, fell, tried again. Ava. He had to reach her. He stumbled down the trail toward town, using trees for support. His head throbbed where they'd struck him. Warm blood trickled down his neck. The 2-mile journey became an endless nightmare of pain and desperation. The lights of Silver Hollow swam in his vision as he reached the outskirts. Voices drifted from the direction of the jail. An angry crowd. He heard Silas speaking, though the words were unclear. Then Ava's voice, defiant even in chains. "The truth will out," she called. "God sees what you've done." Rough laughter followed. Asher tried to move faster, but his legs betrayed him. He collapsed against the general store's back wall, leaving a smear of blood on the weathered boards. The door creaked open. Sarah Miller, the storekeeper's wife, gasped at the sight of him. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, quickly looking both ways before helping him inside. "They're watching the streets. Come on." She led him through the darkened store to a trap door. The root cellar below was cool and smelled of earth and potatoes. Sarah helped him down the ladder, then hurried to fetch water and bandages. "They dragged her through town like an animal," Sarah said as she cleaned his wounds. Her gentle hands belied the anger in her voice. "Made a show of it. Silas had that preacher declare her a heretic, riling up the mob. They've got her in the jail now. The hanging's set for sunrise." Asher's chest tightened, not just from his broken ribs. "I failed her," he whispered, tears mixed with blood on his face. "I swore to protect her." "You tried," Sarah said softly. "That's more than most would do." She bound his ribs and cleaned the gash on his head, working by lantern light. Above them, boots thumped across the store floor. Voices called out, searching. Sarah quickly extinguished the lantern. In the pitch darkness, Asher pressed his forehead against the cold earth wall. "Lord," he prayed, voice breaking, "does mercy even matter anymore? When justice turns blind? When good men stay silent?" His tears fell freely now. "I couldn't save my brother in the war. Now I can't save her." The searching footsteps faded. Sarah relit the lantern, moving to check behind some barrels. She stopped suddenly. "Mr. Boone," she whispered. "Look." She pulled something from behind a barrel, a leather-bound book, its pages wrinkled from snow but intact. Asher's heart leaped. The journal. "How?" he breathed. "One of Silas's men, young Tommy Wells. He was drunk last night, bragging about the cabin fire. Said he grabbed this before setting the blaze." Sarah's eyes flashed. "I slipped him extra whiskey, waited till he passed out in the alley. Seemed the Lord's own timing." Asher took the journal with trembling hands. Here was the proof. The land deeds, the records of bribes, the murders. Everything Ava's husband had died trying to expose. Everything she had nearly died protecting. Hope flickered in the darkness, small as a candle flame, but growing stronger. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need paper, ink, and someone who can ride fast to the territorial marshal in Denver." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "My boy can take the message. He knows the back trails, but you're in no condition to—" "By sunrise," Asher interrupted. "Either justice comes to Silver Hollow, or I die trying to bring it." He touched the cross hanging from Sarah's neck. "Your faith gave you courage to help us. Mine tells me to stand, even when I can barely walk." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll fetch what you need. And Mr. Boone?" She squeezed his hand. "I'll pray too, for mercy and justice both." In the cellar's dim light, Asher opened the journal. Page by page, the truth that had cost so many lives emerged. His ribs screamed with each breath, but he kept reading, kept hoping, kept praying. Above him, the night deepened toward dawn. Somewhere in the jail, Ava waited. He would not let her wait alone. Asher's broken ribs screamed in protest as he heaved the saddle onto Hiram's back. The mule shifted uneasily, sensing his master's pain. Working by touch more than sight in the pitch-black night, Asher's trembling fingers fumbled with the buckles. Each movement sent fresh waves of agony through his battered body. The storm had blown in fast, dropping thick curtains of snow that erased the world beyond Sarah Miller's barn. No moon lit the sky. No stars pierced the heavy clouds. Only occasional flashes of lightning revealed the white-shrouded landscape. "Easy now, old friend," Asher whispered, patting Hiram's neck. The mule's breath steamed in the frigid air. "One more hard ride." His head throbbed where Wade's men had struck him. Dried blood still caked his collar. Sarah had tried to convince him to rest longer, to wait for help from Denver. But dawn would bring the hangman's noose for Ava. Time was a luxury they didn't have. The journal was secure in his saddlebag, wrapped in oiled cloth against the weather. Sarah's boy had already departed for Denver hours ago, carrying copies of the most damning pages. But the territorial marshal was 2 days' ride away. Today's justice would have to come from other hands. Asher led Hiram out into the storm. The snow fell so thick he could barely see 3 feet ahead. Wind cut through his coat like knives of ice. Every step jarred his injuries. But he kept moving, guiding Hiram towards the creek trail. The familiar path now felt treacherous and strange. Drifts had erased the usual landmarks. Tree branches, heavy with snow, creaked and groaned overhead. Twice, Hiram nearly lost his footing on hidden ice. After what felt like hours, they reached the creek crossing. The water ran black between white banks, its surface starting to freeze in the bitter cold. Here, Asher reined Hiram to a stop. A figure emerged from the shadows of a lightning-struck pine. Even in the darkness, there was no mistaking the quiet dignity of White Elk. The Ute elder's silver hair was dusted with snow, his weathered face grave in the storm's gloom. "You ride wounded," White Elk said simply. It wasn't a question. Asher nodded, trying to hide how much effort it took just to stay mounted. "They mean to hang her at sunrise." "I know." White Elk's dark eyes held ancient wisdom and fresh pain. "The woman showed mercy when others would not. She cut me free from their ropes, though it cost her everything." He touched the faded scar on his own neck. "I owe her breath." The elder sat astride a sturdy paint horse, a rifle across his lap. More shapes moved in the darkness behind him, other riders waiting silent as shadows. "Your people risk much," Asher said softly. "Justice knows no boundaries." White Elk's voice carried despite the howling wind. "The Creator sees all hearts the same." Together they turned their mounts toward town. Neither man spoke as they rode through the deepening snow. Other hoofbeats whispered behind them. White Elk's companions following like ghosts. Near midnight, they reached the great pine where Asher had first found Ava hanging. The rope still dangled from a high branch, stiff with ice. The wooden sign lay half buried in snow at the tree's base. "White men don't forgive." Asher's chest tightened at the sight. Memories flooded back. Her cold body in his arms, the purple bruises on her throat, her fevered whispers of prayer and pain. He slid carefully from the saddle, ignoring how his ribs protested. The snow soaked through his pants as he knelt beneath the pine. Head bowed, he struggled to find words. So much hung on what would happen at dawn. So many lives balanced on the edge of mercy or vengeance. "Lord," he whispered finally, "let mercy triumph over judgment." His voice broke. "Give me strength to stand, to do what's right no matter the cost." White Elk dismounted silently. The elder's moccasins made no sound in the fresh snow as he approached. His hand came to rest on Asher's shoulder. Gentle but firm, like a father steadying a son. "Then ride as mercy," White Elk said softly. The words seemed to echo in the storm-tossed night. Ride as mercy, not as vengeance, not as rage, but as the very thing Ava had shown to others, even at the cost of her own safety. Asher looked up at the dangling rope, at the sign half buried in snow. The message was clear enough. Some believed forgiveness impossible across the boundaries of race and culture. But here stood two men from different worlds, united by something stronger than hatred. Lightning flashed again, briefly, illuminating the scene. White Elk's companions waited in a loose circle. 8 riders, their faces painted for whatever battle morning might bring. They sat their horses with quiet resolve, prepared to stand for justice even if it meant facing down their own neighbors. "Dawn comes soon," White Elk said, helping Asher back to his feet. The pain in Asher's body seemed to recede slightly, pushed back by something stronger. Purpose filled him, straight as an arrow's flight. The storm was beginning to ease, its fury spending itself in the dark hours before sunrise. They mounted up again. The pine tree's shadow stretched behind them like a blessing as they turned toward Silver Hollow. In the east, the first pale gold of dawn was just beginning to touch the edge of the world. Asher touched the journal in his saddlebag, feeling its weight of truth. Then he looked at White Elk, at the other riders waiting in the growing light. None of them rode alone now. The snow continued to fall, but softer now, like a clean page waiting to be written. Together they moved forward, carrying mercy like a torch through the darkness, while morning painted the sky in colors of hope. Morning came to Silver Hollow with the bite of steel. Frost rimed the scaffold boards that had been hammered together through the night. The gallows rose stark against the pale sky, its fresh-cut pine bleeding sap that froze in amber teardrops. By 7 o'clock, a crowd had begun to gather in the town square. They huddled in clusters, breath smoking in the bitter air. Women clutched shawls tight around their shoulders. Men shifted from boot to boot, their faces hard as the frozen ground. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, sensing the weight of what was to come. The rope swayed in the winter wind, casting its shadow back and forth across weathered boards. Sheriff Hodge tested the trapdoor twice, his movements mechanical. Each metallic clang of the mechanism echoed off the surrounding buildings like a church bell tolling judgment. At 7:15, they brought Ava from the jail. Her wrists were bound before her with hemp rope, but she walked with her head high. The night in the cold cell had left bruises on her face, yet her eyes remained clear and steady. Her black hair, still damp from the snow, hung loose down her back. As the guards led her up the 13 steps, whispers rippled through the gathering crowd. Some crossed themselves. Others spat in the snow. A few turned away, unable to watch. Silas Hodge stood on the platform in his fine black coat, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He nodded to his cousin, the sheriff, who began reading the charges in a flat voice. Ava Lanier, you stand accused of treason against the Colorado Territory, conspiring with hostile Indians, and the murder of your husband, James Lanner. Ava lifted her face to the pearl-gray sky. Her lips moved in silent prayer, forming words that had sustained her through darker nights than this. When the sheriff finished, she spoke clearly enough for all to hear. "The Lord is my shepherd," she began, her voice carrying across the hushed square. "I shall not want." The familiar psalm seemed to hover in the frozen air. Some in the crowd unconsciously mouthed the words with her, years of Sunday services rising up unbidden. A few women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." "That's enough of that," Silas snapped, nodding to the executioner. The black hood was brought forward. Ava continued praying as they slipped it over her head, her voice muffled but unfaltering. The noose settled around her neck, rope rough against the old bruises. The executioner adjusted the knot behind her left ear, a hangman's knot designed to snap the neck quickly. Almost a mercy. Sheriff Hodge gripped the lever that would drop the trap door. His knuckles showed white through his skin. For just a moment, his eyes met his cousin's, seeking final confirmation. Silas gave a slight nod. The lever began to move. "Stop!" The shout cracked like a rifle shot across the square. Heads turned. Gasps rose from the crowd as a rider burst through their midst, snow flying from his horse's hooves. It was Asher Boone, his face bloodied but determined. In his upraised hand, he clutched a leather-bound book. "You'll hang an innocent woman to bury your theft," he cried, pulling his mount to a halt beside the scaffold. Despite his injuries, he swung down from the saddle and took the steps 2 at a time. Silas's hand twitched toward his coat pocket. "This is a legal execution, stranger. Best ride on." But Asher was already on the platform. He snatched the hood from Ava's head, revealing her face to the crowd. Then he turned and hurled the journal at Pastor Cray's feet. The book hit the boards with a solid thump, its pages falling open. "Read it," Asher commanded. "Read what's written there in Silas Hodge's own hand." The pastor hesitated, then bent to retrieve the journal. His eyes widened as they fell on the exposed page. The crowd pressed closer, straining to hear. "This," Pastor Cray's voice shook. He cleared his throat and began again. "This 23rd day of April, 1878, I, Silas Hodge, do hereby confess to the forging of land deeds and the murder of James Lanier." A murmur ran through the gathered townspeople. Sheriff Hodges' hand fell away from the lever as though it had suddenly grown hot. "It's lies," Silas snarled, but his face had gone pale beneath his neat beard. "Forgeries and slander." "That's your signature," the pastor said quietly, "and your seal as notary." He held up the page so others could see the elaborate flourish and red wax stamp at the bottom. "Those are the same marks you used on our mining deed last spring," called Samuel Turner from the crowd. Other voices joined in, recognition dawning as years of suspicious dealings suddenly took on new meaning. Silas's composure cracked. His hand plunged into his coat, emerging with a Colt revolver. "I won't be ruined by a half-breed witch and a mountain man." But before he could level the weapon, another sound split the morning, the distinctive click of multiple rifle hammers being drawn back. White Elk and his warriors had materialized at the edge of the square, their rifles trained on the scaffold. "The truth fears no bullets," White Elk said calmly. The sheriff looked from his cousin to the armed Utes, then to the damning journal in the pastor's hands. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and unpinned his badge. The silver star fell into the snow with a soft puff. "Caleb," Silas hissed, "you swore an oath." "To the law," the former sheriff replied, "not to murder." He drew his own revolver and pointed it at his cousin. "Drop the gun, Silas." For a moment, the whole square seemed to hold its breath. Silas's finger tightened on the trigger. One shot would be all it took to silence the truth forever. But he was surrounded now, by rifles, by witnesses, by his own written confession. The Colt slipped from his fingers and clattered on the scaffold boards. Asher's hands were already working at the noose around Ava's neck. As it fell away, she swayed slightly. He caught her, supporting her weight as he cut through the ropes at her wrists. "You came back," she whispered. "Couldn't let you face the valley alone," he replied softly. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, painting the snow-covered square in shades of gold. Its light fell on the open journal, on White Elk's silent warriors, on the townspeople drawing closer to read the evidence of corruption in their midst. It touched Ava's face as she stood free on the scaffold that had meant to be her death, and it caught the tears on her cheeks. Tears not of fear now, but of vindication. Silas Hodge stood with his head bowed, his fine coat dusty with snow, as two of his former deputies stepped forward to take him into custody. The crowd's murmuring grew louder, years of suspicions and whispered fears finally finding voice. Sheriff Hodges' badge lay half buried in the snow, its silver star catching the morning light like a promise of justice renewed. Above the scaffold, the empty noose swayed gently in the wind, a reminder of how close hatred had come to triumph, and how mercy had arrived just in time. Silas's finger tightened on the trigger, his face contorted with rage. The crowd held its breath as the morning sun glinted off the Colt's barrel. But before he could squeeze off a shot, a commanding voice rang out across the square. "Enough blood." White Elk stepped forward from the crowd, his weathered hand raised in a gesture of peace. Snow crunched beneath his moccasins as he approached the scaffold with deliberate steps. His dark eyes held Silas's with unwavering calm. "Lower the gun, brother," White Elk said softly. "Too many spirits already cry in these hills." The old Utes' presence seemed to fill the space between Silas and his intended targets. With gentle firmness, White Elk placed his hand over Silas's trembling fingers. The touch was like a father steadying a frightened child. "White man forgives," White Elk continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. "When he remembers he's dust, same dust that makes the corn grow, same dust that returns to earth." Slowly, Like ice melting in spring, the tension drained from Silas's arm. The Colt lowered inch by inch until it pointed at the wooden planks. White Elk carefully took the weapon and handed it to one of his warriors. Sheriff Hodge watched the exchange with growing shame etched across his features. His hand rose to the badge that had become a weight heavier than lead. With trembling fingers, he unpinned the silver star. It caught the light as it arced through the air, landing with a soft puff in a drift of pristine snow. "I've worn this too long," he said hoarsely. "Worn it while justice bled." The crowd that had gathered for blood began to disperse, their bloodlust dissolving like morning frost. Some hung their heads, unable to meet their neighbors' eyes. Others wept openly, the weight of their nearly witnessed sin pressing down like physical pain. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, sensing the gravity of what had almost happened in their town square. Silas, his power broken, his corruption exposed, backed away from the scaffold. His polished boots stumbled on the steps. Without his cousin's protection or his stolen authority, he was nothing but a common criminal. He turned and fled down an alley, but everyone knew his freedom would be brief. The telegraph lines were already humming with messages to the United States Marshals. Ava's legs finally gave out. The strength that had held her upright through the reading of false charges, through the prayers, through the terror of the noose, it drained away like water through sand. She swayed, then fell forward into Asher's waiting arms. He caught her gently, cradling her against his chest as though she were made of spun glass. Her fingers clutched at his coat as tears soaked into the rough wool. They were tears of relief, of release, of deliverance long delayed but finally arrived. From the church tower, bells began to ring. But these were not the slow, solemn tolls that had earlier summoned people to witness death. These peals rang bright and clear, singing of life and mercy and second chances. They echoed off the surrounding mountains and came back transformed into music. Pastor Cray stood rooted to the spot, the damning journal still open in his trembling hands. His face was a study in devastation as he confronted how close he had come to sanctioning murder in God's name. The pages before him blurred as tears filled his eyes. His lips moved in silent prayer, but for once he had no verses to quote, no sermons to give. There was only the bowed head of a man discovering his own desperate need for the grace he preached. The morning sun broke fully through the clouds now, setting the snow-covered square ablaze with light. It touched the empty noose, transforming the rope into a golden crown above the scaffold where death had been thwarted by mercy. It warmed the faces of White Elk's warriors as they lowered their rifles, their presence ensuring that justice would have its day without violence. Most of all, it shone on Asher and Ava, still wrapped in their embrace of survival and deliverance. His arms tightened protectively around her as the last of the crowd dispersed, leaving them alone with their hard-won victory. The silver badge lay half buried in the snow, its star a reminder that true authority comes not from men's laws, but from the higher law of love and forgiveness. Above them, the bells continued their joyful song, ringing out the old order and welcoming the new. Spring came to Silver Hollow like God's own mercy, gentle and unstoppable. The warming winds stripped winter's bitter memories from the mountainsides, leaving hope in their wake. Snowmelt rushed down from the high country, its voice a constant song in the creeks and gullies. In the newly whitewashed agency office, morning light spilled across the clerk's broad oak desk, where Asher and Ava worked side by side. Their fingers brushed occasionally as they passed documents between them, each touch a reminder of survival and promise. The stack of land deeds before them represented weeks of patient labor, untangling Silas's web of lies and restoration of what was stolen. "This section here," Ava said, indicating a map with her pencil. "That's traditional grazing land. It belongs to White Elk's people." Her other hand smoothed the fresh parchment deed that would return it to its rightful owners. Asher nodded, carefully recording the boundaries. "Reckon half and half is fair. Good grazing for both herds." He dipped his pen and wrote in his steady hand, marking the division between settler and Ute territory. The ink flowed dark and true, like justice finally finding its course. The agency clerk, Mr. Patterson, watched from his corner desk with quiet approval. The old man had survived Silas's regime by keeping his head down, but now he sat straighter, pride returning to his shoulders as honest work filled his ledgers once more. When the last deed was filed, Ava pressed her hand to the window glass. Outside, the valley lay bright with promise. New grass pushed through the mud, and the first brave wildflowers dotted the south-facing slopes. "It's like the land itself is starting fresh," she whispered. On a clear morning when the aspens showed their first pale green buds, White Elk gathered a small circle near the creek. His weathered hands raised in blessing over Asher and Ava as they stood beneath the young trees. No church bells rang, no crowd gathered to witness, but the moment carried its own sacred weight. "The Creator sees hearts," White Elk said simply. "These two, hearts, He has already joined through trial and mercy." His words carried on the spring breeze as he bound their hands with a soft leather cord, a symbol of two cultures braided into one stronger whole. Asher's voice shook slightly as he spoke his vows, still unused to speaking his heart aloud. But his eyes never left Ava's face, steady as the mountains behind them. When she answered him, her words were strong and clear, carrying both English and Ute promises of faithfulness. They built their new cabin near the Singing Creek, far enough from town for peace, but close enough to maintain the bridges they'd helped rebuild. Asher's skilled hands shaped the logs, while Ava planted herbs and vegetables in the rich spring soil. Each evening they sat on their small porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in colors of healing. One warm afternoon, Ava walked to the great pine tree, the place where death had almost claimed her. But now new life sprouted from its roots, tiny seedlings reaching towards light. She took out her carving knife and began to work on the trunk, her strokes deliberate and sure. Asher found her there as dusk approached. He read the fresh carved words aloud. "God forgave, so can man." "Reckon that's truth written plain," he said softly, standing close behind her. His rough fingers brushed her cheek with a gentleness that still surprised him. "Guess the Lord finally let me love someone." Ava leaned back against him, her hand covering his. "He was just waiting for the right time," she answered. "For both of us." The sun settled over Silver Hollow, painting the valley in shades of gold and promise. Where hatred had once ruled, children played in the streets again. Ute families traded at the general store without fear, and settlers learned to say "thank you" in 2 languages. The wind carried prayer songs from both church and council fire, weaving them together like strands of silver in the evening air. Peace lay across the land like a blessing, written in the honest deeds in the agency office, in the smoke rising from cabin chimneys, in the tracks of deer and cattle sharing the same sweet grass. But most of all, it was written in the way former enemies now nodded in greeting, in shared work and simple words of friendship. Mercy made real in 1,000 small choices to remember they were all made of the same dust, all children of the same sky. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.